morning. This is Rick Newman, Executive Director at the American Museum of Tort Law, with another in our continuing series of interviews with thought leaders on topics of current legal interest. My guest today is Bruce Fein, who is a nationally and internationally known scholar about constitutional law. He is a writer and author. He was formerly the research director for the House Republicans on the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran from 1986 to 87, and general counsel at the Federal Communications Commission from 1983 to 1984. He served as an associate deputy attorney general in the U.S. Department of Justice, where he supervised the department's litigation and vetting of candidates for the federal judiciary. He has been a visiting scholar at the Constitutional Studies at the Heritage Foundation, an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institution, and taught as an adjunct faculty member at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He appears regularly on national media, including MSNBC, Fox, C-SPAN, BBC, Reuters, and NPR, and graduated from Harvard Law School with honors in 1972. It's my great pleasure to welcome my good friend and esteemed scholar, Bruce Fein. Good morning.
Thank you, Rick. You made me sound like the honorifics before a sultan serving the Ottoman Empire.
Well, no, it's great to have you here. And what I wanted to do is talk about the state of play of our democracy. Following the election results, there was no speedy concession. There has been turmoil. There have been repeated challenges to the legitimacy of the election, unfounded and unwarranted claims of massive voter fraud, tampering with voting machines, none of which holds up to any scrutiny. And lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit has been filed and rejected almost immediately by every court that's looked at. What's going on here?
Well, I think it's a mixed picture, Rick. On the one hand, the institutions, in my opinion, have held, as they did in Watergate, both Republican judges and Democrat judges, both Republican secretaries of state and Democrat secretaries of state. Some Republican governors, like the Georgia governor, as well as Democratic ones, stood behind the outcome of the election, which was declared by President Trump's own cybersecurity official, one of the cleanest ever. Indeed, even President Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, has said, no, if there were fraud, it was on a modest or tiny scale, wouldn't have affected the outcome of the election. I know he's not going to appoint a special counsel that President Trump urged to examine these rather delusional allegations of voting fraud. There have been over 50 cases filed. And any lawyer knows you have a full opportunity, provide affidavits, witnesses, if you can prove that a vote was illegally cast, illegally counted. And every one of those cases, except one modest issue concerning how closely monitors could be watching vote counters, failed, and failed with opinions written by Trump appointees, even saying that these are frivolous filings. So to that extent, to some degree, Joe Biden is probably the most legitimate president in recent history, because the examination and scrutiny of the voting has been so intense, and it's come through with flying colors, notwithstanding the challenges of COVID-19, the mail issues as well. The American citizens turned out, they voted, they counted properly, they acted civilized. And what we're hearing really as background noise are the frantic appeals of Mr. Trump, who knows he's lost, and his supporters who don't care about the facts. Indeed, they don't even care about the law. They just say, well, it must be fraud if Trump lost. That's the beginning and end. There is no concern at all for whether or not proper processes have been followed. Now, is that dangerous? It is, if it infects a large portion of the country, because there needs to be a citizen consensus behind process, procedures. You accept the outcome of something that's fair, and you had a full opportunity to participate and have your voice heard. But if you lose for that day, and you continue to exercise free speech, and there'll be additional elections. But we can't have this idea that remarkably has even been surfaced in the Oval Office. Oh, declare martial law, have the military go seize the voting machines, have the military conduct new elections. The fact that those ideas would even be broached with President Trump by a convicted felon like Michael Flynn is truly staggering and worrisome. And it ought to be denounced. But at least at present, I believe we will find a smooth transition, peaceful transition on January 20th when Mr. Biden becomes inaugurated as our next president.
Well, yeah, and you touched on 2 points that I think are worth noting, which is first that these suits are frivolous, and 2 points worth noting is they finally uncovered evidence of voter fraud. I was reading an article earlier today. One 70-year-old man in Pennsylvania fraudulently used his dead mother's social security number to register her to vote for Donald Trump. One voter. Second, a lot of the right-wing media networks, Newsmax among others, have been running these retractions, sort of pulling away from their false and malicious claims that voting machines were in some way controlled by Hugo Chavez or George Soros, that the entire process was corrupt. But that leads to the second and I think more important point. The lawsuits are frivolous, but have tremendous potential to undermine faith in our democracy. So what do we do with lawyers and politicians who are filing frivolous, ungrounded, meritless lawsuits? What is the remedy for this?
Well, we have disciplinary authorities that are entrusted to bar associations, and every lawyer has to be a member of a bar association. Typically, it's a state bar association. There's an American bar association, but it really is not national in the sense that it doesn't confer authority to practice everywhere. It's a state-by-state issue. And not only the bar associations, but the judges themselves have authority sua sponte, means without request, to impose sanctions on a lawyer who's making an absolutely frivolous, factual, or legal claim. And I believe that these lawyers who have filed these obviously frivolous lawsuits, sometimes they're thrown out within minutes. One case filed by the Attorney General of Texas, supported by, I believe, 17 other state attorneys general, had a 2-day shelf life in the U.S. Supreme Court. Yeah. It was tossed out literally in 48 hours without a single dissenting vote. What does that tell you? Especially when you would expect, in any case of seriousness, the Department of Justice, then headed and currently headed by William Barr, to file something. They wouldn't support it. It was so ridiculous. For the audience who doesn't know what the basic thesis of the claim was, Texas argued that it had examined the electoral codes of 4 battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and found them deficient because Texas would have liked the code to have lesser risk of the possibility of fraud. And therefore, it was unconstitutional, and Texas had standing to order the rewriting of the electoral codes of sister states. Now, remember, Texas is one of these jurisdictions that claims the right to secede. They're so fanatical about states' rights, and yet they're claiming a right to tell sister jurisdictions how to write election codes. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you have no standing. This is utterly frivolous. You're out of here.
Right.
But that's an example of the frivolity that we witness.
But should we be troubled by the fact that 17 other state attorneys general joined this lawsuit, that politicians in Washington supported this lawsuit? They are working affirmatively to undermine the election results.
Yes, I do think we should be worried about that, and they ought to be ostracized. And even pushing back further, not only ought the bar associations, because these cases, Rick, they're open and notorious. You don't need archaeology here to discover something buried, in the news. They know what has gone on. They can just read the cases. They're not secret, and take an action without actually a formal complaint. They ought to be very aggressive. But, lawyers protect their own, doctors protect their own, members of Congress protect their own. So you have to push to get them, the bar associations, to do anything. But I would push back, even further, if you will, Rick.
Mhm.
Where are the law schools? What kind of ethics are you inculcating in your students? All these people, these lawyers, they attended law school. They had to pass a moral fitness test to become admitted to the bar. Where's the education process? I mean, even in Pakistan during the dictatorship of Pervez Musharraf, the lawyers protested his emergency rule and basically drove him out of power. That's in Pakistan,
Right.
Where are our lawyers in the United States? In some sense, the social and professional ostracism can be more punishing than actually a fine or suspension or something of that. You just don't deal with these people. They're contemptuous of the law, the rule of law, the process, and they cast the administration of justice into disrepute.
Well, let's fast forward to January 21st. President Biden is now in office. Do we let this go, or should Congress have hearings? Should we petition the states to have their bar associations take action? How do we build in accountability for these efforts to undermine our election? By the way, what is sedition? Are we dealing with sedition?
Well, it comes close to it. Sedition is attempting to overthrow or interfere, with the enforcement of the law by force or violence or threats of force or violence. So it doesn't quite satisfy sedition in the sense that filing a lawsuit, is despicable as it might be because of its ulterior motives, is not using, AK-47s. That's definitely a very large tumble, in depravity. But it verges on sedition in the sense that it attempts to create a climate that would nullify, the legitimacy of government, namely that you needn't comply with the law anymore because your rulers have been elected illegitimately. So in that sense, there's a sedition element to the frivolity of these lawsuits. These people are not legitimate. You don't have to obey them. We need the militia now and your guns, to protect your rights, that kind of thing. And of course, if it did break out into violence, and maybe some of these suits and at least the commentary might amount to incitement to sedition, that would be criminal, to urge people to resort to force or threats to attack and prevent the administration of the laws of the United States.
So where do we go from here? January 21st, Biden's in office. What do we do?
Well, I certainly think that we should pursue the bar associations. I don't think we need to have every lawyer sanctioned, but if you picked out those who are most prominent and whose deterrent effect would be the greatest, Mr. Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, I would select also Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, perhaps a member of the House who joined as an amicus in this frivolous complaint filed in the U.S. Supreme Court, who's a lawyer, and pursue those vigorously. So they set an example as that would deter a repetition in any future kind of election. Those things, it seems to me, are essential. I don't know whether we look just to the president or the administration here. I would look to the law schools.
Mhm.
What are the law schools teaching their students? And part of it is not just the electoral fraud. The lawlessness of the government, and the disrespect for the rule of law is become very pronounced and worrisome. Whether it's usurping the war power, the surveillance power, the treaty power, the power of the purse, the appointments power, all being abused by the president. He turned the White House into a crime scene with Hatch Act violations, and everybody just yawned and said, "Oh well, who cares outside the Beltway?" That we need in the law schools, a special requirement, that every student be immersed in legal ethics and what justice is about, even if it doesn't contribute to their income. So we do have standards in the profession that make it more than just a trade, a profit center, if you will, by creating revenues off of other people's troubles. That seems to me absolutely indispensable, because if the lawyers don't claim and complain about rule of law violations, who is? We're the ones who know the law, can appreciate the egregiousness of the violations. A layman can be excused in part. They don't quite know the deviations from the norm, but the lawyers do know. And to remain silent is not acceptable. I remember, Rick, I believe just a day or two ago, an Obama lawyer, a holdover who served in the Trump administration in the Office of Legal Counsel, wrote a column saying, I shouldn't have done that. I thought if I stayed around, maybe I could help, but I became complicit in all the legal obnoxious overreaches and abuses of the Trump administration. I should have left. I should have protested, a noisy protest.
Yes.
Those are the kinds of things, that we have to inculcate as the ethos of the profession if we're going to restore the rule of law to its proper dignity and centrality to the American way of life.
Yes, and it's so true.
Eric, and I apologize for interjecting here, but I knew in a different capacity John Bolton, and when John Bolton, who was at one time when I knew him, he was head of the Civil Division, of the Department of Justice. He then became acting UN Ambassador, National Security Advisor. Hawk, and I'm not by any means, I'm not endorsing him. When he says obstruction of justice was a way of life at the White House, this is somebody who's on the very, very far right.
And knows what he's
Obstruction of
talking.
justice is a way of life in the White House.
Yeah.
That sounds like the Kremlin or Beijing.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like the United States of America that I was serving. Certainly not when I helped get Richard Nixon impeached and removed from office because he tried to make the White House a way of life for obstruction.
Right. Well, this has been a good discussion. This is to our audience. Bruce and I, in setting this up, had planned to talk about proposed legislation, the Defending Our Democracy Act and the power of pardons. But what I'd like to do is end here and have you back in a week or two as we get closer to the end of his term. Let's see what President Trump does in terms of pardons, and then we'll circle back and discuss that issue. But this is red hot right now, and I would like to get this posted and disseminated so everyone can hear what your thinking is.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for speaking to me, Bruce. I'll talk to you again soon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rick.